Could you tell me anything that you know about Joe Hill?
Joe Hill? I'm not familiar with the name Joe Hill. I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about it.
Was he a famous Salt Lake figure?
Joe Hill? Oh my gosh, I don't know him.
Oh, I know about Joe Hill.
A labor leader.
He was executed for allegedly killing a grocery store owner in a holdup. And until the day of his execution, he maintained that he was innocent. And I just read that his ashes were taken out of Washington, D.C., where they'd been stored and scattered in all the states of the Union, but not Utah, because he said he wouldn't be caught dead in Utah.
That's right.
My name is Phillips. I'm from Nevada City, California. Although before that, I lived for a good many years in Salt Lake City, Utah. I first ran into Joe Hill's name from my parents when I was a boy in Cleveland, Ohio. We moved west in 1947. Both of my parents were organizers. My mother had worked for the CIO. The name was known to me, at least, as a child. And then when we moved to Salt Lake, again, the name kept coming up, both in books that were available on my mother's bookshelves and just in family conversation, but I didn't think much of it. I left Salt Lake to go to Korea as a soldier. I got back, bummed around a good bit, joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, Wobblies, as they're known. Oh, I had flirted with the IWW when I was a boy, but mainly for all the macho reasons, you know. That heavy mantle of American macho descends upon your none too broad shoulders. I joined it again after the experience of Korea simply because I thought that it was right, that what the IWW stood for and fought for was right. It's there that I ran squarely into the life and the work of Joe Hill.
Joe Hill became an important American myth, and he remains so today. His memory has lasted and been preserved now almost 75 years after his execution. And it was very interesting to me how that's happened, how various generations of Americans since then and people outside America have been interested in and kept his memory alive. Joe Hill came to America as a Swedish immigrant, an unskilled laborer who couldn't speak English, and he landed in Ellis Island, lived in the Lower East Side of New York. He had very modest employment, but he had a spirit that prevailed. I've been told by old Wobblies when I first researched that there wasn't anybody better than Joe Hill at catching freight trains and doing the things that the IWW had to do in traveling around the country, doing manual labor and working in factories.
I remember once I was on a trip and visiting an old-timer in the California desert, old Frenchie, and he had himself a little shack in some town on the eastern slope of the Sierras, just below Mount Whitney. And he was telling me, he says, you know, I remember once I was up working in docks with this big Swedish kid, young Swedish guy. And he's just another Swede to me, nice guy, but I had no idea at the time that he was going to become an international folk hero, an international labor martyr. He was just a bloke like anybody else. And that's what Joe Hill considered himself. He had no intention of becoming a labor martyr. Joe Hill shouldn't be known for dying. He should be known what he did during his life. That he was a labor agitator, a union organizer, a cartoonist, a songwriter, and a writer.
One of the first things when I got to the Wobbly office in Chicago that I found out about was that we have Joe Hill's ashes here. Joe Hill wrote this poem about his ashes, where he says what he wants to do with his body, and he says, my body, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let the merry breezes blow, my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. And then this is my last and final will, good luck to all of you. And I think when he talks about saying that a fading flower will come to life and bloom again where his ashes fall. I feel like that's very symbolic of what can happen with this union, getting his ashes back. We're seeing a lot of new organizing in the union all across the country, especially in the Northwest, and I think that what we need to do here is pick up on some of that organizing, support it, and reinforce it.
I'm a former auto worker. I worked 5 years at Pontiac Motors and in various small metal and chemical plants before that. Wobblies organized the first major strike in auto in 1913 at Studebaker in Detroit. 6 months later, Henry Ford, to keep labor unrest out of his new plant in Highland Park, granted the 5-hour day. Wobbly organizers were there in the 30s when, before the CIO unions came up, and it was Wobblies, along with socialists and communists, that were organizing the rank and file, and that gave birth to the CIO. So Wobblies have been there, and more importantly, the principles of rank and file unionism have never died and never gone away. They've been suppressed both by the unions and the bosses in the government, but they've not gone away.
I explored the material around Joe Hill. I read as much as I could. I talked to the elders who had known him. Wildly contradictory stories about Joe being a very calm, very pacific sort of human being, unruffled. Other stories saying he had a sudden temper, sudden fits of anger, was unpredictable. Other people said, well, no, he never played an instrument that I know of. And other folks said, well, he played the piano and the guitar and maybe the mandolin. You talk to any number of people, you'll get any number of Joe Hills, which makes you really curious about him, you know.
He wrote lyrics to songs mainly, but he did write articles. He was a prodigious cartoonist as well as a painter. In his house in Gävle in Sweden, I saw some of his canvases that he did while he was still in Sweden. And he was an accomplished painter.
Joe himself was an immigrant. Joel Emanuel Hegeland, a Blumen worker. His name became Joseph Hillstrom, then Joe Hill. It's hard to believe that somebody who probably spoke with a thick accent was able to tap the American idiom so thoroughly. There's no way of knowing by listening to or reading his songs or even his letters that this man was an immigrant, and a fairly recent immigrant at that.
He knew how to enter a strike, capture it in a little song, disseminate the song, leave town, have the song become famous and have the song become very useful in terms of winning a strike.
He was either some kind of chameleon and a sort of genius. Either that or he was like an average man caught in a melon patch, because you can get that impression too.
1905, the union was formed. It was formed as an industrial union as opposed to the skill unions that the AFL organized at the time. We're talking about coal miners, we're talking about lumberjacks. By 1915, we're talking about agricultural workers. Many of the members were immigrants. We're talking about Finnish, Swedes, Germans, or Bohemians, Czechs, Slavs. Certainly at the time, it was the only major union which did not discriminate against people based on sex or color. They organized women. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is a well-known IWW organizer who later in the 1930s joined the Communist Party. But during the heyday of the IWW, she was an organizer and she played an important part. So the IWW organized anybody and everybody who'd be willing to change and overthrow the existing status quo.
I bugged my way up to Yellowstone National Park when I was a boy, just looking for work, running away from home, really. That is the essence of the American experience, you know, running away from home. I think Joe knew all about that. And I learned to play the guitar and started making up songs about what was going on around me. I think when I encountered Joe Hill's songs, they seemed to be so much a part of what was going on around me. We were involved in things like Fair Play for Cuba and Recognized Mainland China. We were involved in the Civil Rights Movement, which was an enormously powerful singing movement coming out of a black Baptist and black gospel tradition. I began realizing that I had been singing folk music most of my life, but that this music that I was encountering in the IWW, Joe Hill, T-Bone Slim, Richard Brazier, was as much folk music as on top of Old Smoky or down in the valley, that it was just as much ours, that the reason why it wasn't heard very much was because it was a bit more threatening than, well, I was never awfully threatened by down in the valley myself, but this music was a good bit more threatening. It was also just as plain as grass and pretty as a new gold watch, just peasant music, as Hugo Torres described it to me up here in Winnipeg a little while ago. It was closer to the peasant music he remembered as a child in Chile.
Well, the workers on the SP lines to strike sent out a call. But Casey Jones, the engineer, he wouldn't strike at all. His boiler, it was leaking, and his engine's on the bum, and his drivers and his parent, they were all out of plumb. Casey Jones kept his junk pile running. Casey Jones, he's working double time. Casey Jones, he got a wooden medal for being good and faithful to the SP line. Well, the worker said to Casey, won't you help us win the strike? But Casey Jones said, let me alone, you better take a hike. And someone put a railroad tie right across the track. And Casey hit the river with an awful crack. Casey Jones hit the river bottom. Casey Jones, he broke his blooming spine. Casey Jones, he became an Angelino. He took a trip to heaven on the SP line. Well, Casey Jones got up to heaven to the pearly gate. He said, I'm Casey Jones, the guy that pulled the SP freight. You're just the man, said St. Peter. Our musicians, they're on strike. You can get a job of scabbing anytime you like. Casey Jones got a job in heaven. Casey Jones, he's doing mighty fine. Casey Jones went scabbing on the angels just like he did to workers on the SP line. Well, the angels got together and they said it wasn't fair for Casey Jones to go around a scabbing everywhere. And Angels Union number 23, they sure were there. They promptly fired Casey down the golden stairs. Casey Jones went to hell a-flying. Casey Jones, well, the devil said, oh, fine. Casey Jones, get busy shoveling sulfur. That's what you get for scabbing on the SP line.
Often when I'm interviewed by the mainstream media, I always say this is not the end of the labor movement and this is historical. I mean, this happens. You have everything has ups and downs. What family doesn't, as Captain Hepburn said in The Lion in Winter. But that there is, in fact, a resurgence of what we're calling workers' culture or labor arts.
Workers' culture, well, the IWW certainly made one of the richest contributions to workers' culture in the United States of any labor organization or social movement in the 20th century. Stories, songs, cartoons, graphics, direct action techniques, part of workers' culture. The soapboxing, the roving picket line, especially used during the Lawrence, Massachusetts textile strike, where the striking women linked arms and in a nonviolent way just moved through the stores in downtown Lawrence. The sit-down strike, that's part of workers' culture, and that was started in 1907 in Schenectady, New York, by the IWW.
This is a very rejection of the idea that culture is for those who are in the upper economic, strata. That culture is not for us poor working people. This is the Joe Hill poster. Actually, it's the second Joe Hill poster, and I cut a new one because the first one I had mounted on some pretty bad wood, and since I had to make so many, I said, well, I'm going to make it easier for myself. I did this back in '86 when they were celebrating the Haymarket Centennial. Lucy Gonzalez or Lucia Gonzalez de Parsons, people would ask me, how long have I been in art? I always have the answer that my earliest memories are having my hands slapped for sketching on the wallpaper. I've been messing around with art more or less all my life. This is an oil painting from a sketch I did when I was visiting the IWW group down in Houston, Texas, the Marine Transport Workers Group. And Lenore's bar is where our delegate was tending bar, and he used that as headquarters. My early 20s, I got involved in oil painting. Then I was a cartoonist, artist for the Industrial Worker. And when the Industrial Worker could no longer afford to have photo engravings of line drawings made, I started using lino blocks. And now, since I'm retired, I'm working full-time on making posters, making woodcuts, making graphics. As I tell people, I no longer punch a clock. I've entered the most productive phase of my life.
And that's what it's all about. That's what workers' culture is about. That's what the labor arts movement is about, is reclaiming our artistic expression. I mean, we pass the history of our lives through the stories and the music that we tell.
Joe Hill, as a figure within the Union, is mostly recognized for his songs, because his songs not only display what the union thinks is important, especially the relationship between the bosses and the workers, but also shows why union is important, that you have to have solidarity among workers in the workplace.
And of course, the songs that Joe wrote were extremely simple, like, so many of those that worked in the forest in the Northwest told me, that you could find 7, 8, 9 languages spoken in the forest, that people couldn't even talk to each other, couldn't debate with each other, hadn't had a chance to go to school, had no real intellectual life. If the songs were going to be understood, they had to be dead simple.
When you sing Power in the Union, that is a song which has a vivid imagination. You know what it's like to have power in the union. Other songs that he has written, I can't remember a lot of them off the top of my head, but say The Preacher and the Slave, many people have a hard time understanding that because the preachers are the Salvation Army, and the Salvation Army's role in society in 1910 was much different than it is today. It doesn't take such a confrontational attitude towards the labor movement, for example. But if you could, in a sense, redress the preacher as your liberal congressman, the song would be the same.
Long-haired preachers come out every night, try and tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked about something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You will eat in that sweet by and by. That's a lie. And the Starvation Army, they play. They sing and they clap and they pray when they get all your corn on the drum. They will tell you you're on the bum. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You will eat in that sweet by and by. if you fight for the good things in life. They will tell you to stop all the strife. Be a sheep for the bosses, they say. Or to hell you are sure on the way. Working folk of all countries unite. Side by side we for freedom will fight. When the world and its wealth we have gained, to the grafters we'll sing this refrain. You will eat by and by, when you've learned how to cook and to fry. Chop some wood, it'll do you good, and you'll eat in that sweet by and by. That's no lie.
We have always sung. One of the things that identifies culture, that identifies a group, is its song. When we came into the industrial system, we brought our songs with us, just like we brought our holidays. We brought our clothing styles, our recipes, our voodoo. You know, we brought all of that with us, and we brought our songs too. Our songs, when we were in rural circumstances, dealt with every aspect of that existence. Well, so with the songs that were created in an industrial situation, they deal with every aspect of our existence, you see. And Joe's songs really just fit that bill perfectly.
One of my earliest songs I remembered was a old 78 record I have in one of these boxes. We had it on these wind-up Victrolas. And it wasn't a song Joe Hill wrote, it was a song that somebody else wrote, parody to a tune. An earlier wobbly, Haywire Mac McClintock, supposedly wrote it. He claimed to write it, but Haywire Mac, you bought enough drinks for him, he'd claim anything. Joe Hill added a few verses, but it was a Hallelujah, I'm a bum, you know. Oh, why don't you work like other men do? How in the heck can I work when there's no work to do? Hallelujah, I'm a bum. And other verses like, oh, why don't you save all the money you earn? If I didn't eat, I'd have money to burn.
There's a raging controversy among the worker culturalists about whether they chose the music because they were making fun of religion, or whether they chose the music because it was a nifty little tune. I don't care. Who knows? Joe Hill's in here. We can't ask him. But I think basically what it comes down to is you hear a catchy tune and it works, you can use it. If you want to parody it because it's representing McDonald's, then great. But I mean, I'm sure there are various reasons, but it does work for that reason because people know it.
But the practice of writing labor songs, parodies to popular music of the day, came from the time when the IWW would have a street meeting. They would manage to have the Salvation Army kitty corner with their band singing hymns. So what they did was they wrote their own words to these tunes. And before they knew it, they'd be singing, and the people who were gathered around the Salvation Army came and joined the IWW to sing their version.
One time we were driving back from a gig in Flint, and there's an oldies radio station on, and we started singing the old George Clinton song, When the Parliament's Funkadelics. I just want to testify what your love has done to me. And we changed it around. It became, I just want to testify what my union means to me. I was working a 12-hour shift. My hands were numb at my side. A man came up and said, my friend, you know you're taken for a ride. He told me to sign with the union, join with the union today. And it goes on, when he joins the union and gets all together and then, warns brothers and sisters that they have to join with the union because, they fought for things in the past and we're losing ground and it's up to us to hold on to it. So we need a union more now than we did yesterday, and that's why I say, I just want to testify what my union means to me. And it goes on, and you know, people love it, especially when we're performing for a predominantly African-American audience who don't want to hear Union Made and who don't really care about those other old labor songs. But they hear that and people start tapping their feet and snapping their fingers like, oh yeah, I can relate to this. And that's important. I mean, culture isn't any good unless it reflects the values of the people around it and the style of the kind of music. So we're seeing that come in, and I feel like we are upholding a tradition of the Wobblies, of Joe Hill, in presenting music that's taken from popular culture and adapting it.
Joe Hill arrived in Utah in 1913 after coming from San Pedro, California, where he worked as a stevedore. In January of that year, 1914, he was arrested for a murder. The events surrounding his arrest were violent. He was shot by the police when they entered his bedroom. He himself was wounded prior to his arrest. The night of the murder of a grocer and his son, Joe Hill was wounded in an altercation. The events related to that altercation are very murky. Joe Hill claims that he was shot by a jealous husband coming home after Joe Hill having been with the wife. The police claim that he was wounded escaping from the grocer's store. Most scholars agree that the evidence Joe Hill was convicted on could never convict anyone today. But he was convicted and he was executed. But during the interim from his conviction to his execution, a year passed, and during that year, the myth of Joe Hill was developed. The myth went that the copper bosses, the industrial captains of Utah, engineered his arrest and execution.
Clearly, both the copper bosses and the Mormon Church were anti-radical and anti-union. There's no question about that. They had no sympathy for conservative unionism, let alone the IWW. Whether there was any collusion between those folks and the execution of Hill is another question, and historically speaking is difficult to really assess.
From a lawyer's standpoint, there's been serious question as to whether or not Joe Hill had a fair trial. There's questions about the evidence that was presented, questions about the appeal, and that's something that has haunted the case for many, many years. And I think the legal community has always had an interest in the case and, assess the case in a way of if he had a trial today and the same type of evidence was presented or was tried to be presented, he probably wouldn't be found guilty. But the temper of the times in 1915 were such that he was in fact found guilty. And historically, the claim is that his appeal was kind of given short shrift.
The media was involved too, and both the Deseret News, the Mormon-owned newspaper, and the Salt Lake Tribune and others that were not particularly responsive to the Mormon Church were just as sensational in their coverage of the case and their coverage of Hill and stuff. It was a real media circus.
We're still debating whether or not capital punishment should be the law of the land. And back then, that was an issue that people raised and people were concerned about. So it's something, here we are 75 years later, and we're still debating the value of capital punishment.
He was sentenced to die by the state of Utah, and the method of execution was the firing squad. Some of his best-known songs were written while he was in prison waiting execution. His most famous song, The Rebel Girl, the tune of which he wrote, was written. And contrary to what some people say, it was dedicated to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. It was dedicated to all women who worked for the betterment of the working class.
There are women of many distinctions in this wide world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes. There are blue-blooded queens and princesses who have charms made of diamonds and pearls. But the only and thoroughbred lady is the rebel girl. That's the rebel girl, that's the rebel girl. To the working class, she's a precious pearl. She brings courage, pride, and joy. To the fighting rebel boy, we've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. For it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl. Yes, her hands may be hardened from labor, and her dress may not be very fine, but her heart in her bosom is beating. That is true to her class and her kind. And the grafters in terror will tremble when her spite and defiance she'll hurl. For the only and thoroughbred lady is the rebel girl. That's the rebel girl, that's the rebel girl. To the working class, she's a precious pearl. She brings courage, pride, and joy. To the fighting rebel boy, we've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. For it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl.
There was an amazing national appeal made, as big as the Sacco and Vanzetti appeal, that resulted in Woodrow Wilson, who was President of the United States, actually requesting the governor of Utah to forbear and stop the execution about a month before it was to occur. And many other people were involved and appealed to Utah's officials to take another look at the evidence, to stop the execution, that an innocent man was being railroaded to his death.
Was it sort of paraphrasing Doctorow in the Daniel, the book of Daniel, a powerful book that everybody ought to wade into if you want to see what can really happen? That a radical makes connections between the obvious data, the available data, and root causes. And if you make enough of those connections between available data and root causes, there's a good chance the last connection you'll make is that between the power of the state and your own death.
The execution was stopped temporarily, and then no new evidence was presented, and Joe Hill wouldn't explain his unexplained gunshot wound other than to repeat the story that he was wounded by a jealous husband. And that wasn't good enough for the officials of Utah, and so the plans for the execution proceeded. Woodrow Wilson intervened again just hours prior to the actual execution, but this time the governor of Utah was determined to carry out the execution and get this over with in Utah. But in fact, they did execute Joe Hill, but they didn't actually get it over with, because Joe Hill's importance only increased after his execution.
I remember the Sugar House prison where Joe was killed. Huge red sandstone place up on 13th East and 21st South that was torn down while I was in Salt Lake. They made a public park. I got the surveyor's plats that could pace off where that chair was that Joe was tied to when he was killed. And that was my thinking spot. That's where I stood when I decided to leave Utah.
But in 1915, in November, winter was just approaching Utah, and that November 19th was the execution date for Joe Hill. In the courtyard, or in the prison yard of the prison, they had set up a gunny sack covered execution booth where small holes were cut in the burlap, and riflemen had stuck the guns through the holes and hid their faces from public view behind the curtain. Joe Hill was strapped into a wooden chair, and he was placed against the wall, and he was blindfolded. And as the captain of the execution squad was starting to give the orders, ready, aim, Joe Hill is the one who cried out, "Fire."
there's a real connectedness, I think, that one feels here to history. If you've read Wobbly history, it's extraordinarily, I don't know, it just seems really American history when these people really went out and they took some chances and they trusted themselves and they battled with the goons and the bosses and they got beat up a lot. And they got written out of the history books. I don't want to seem too mystical, but there's some kind of honor that I think we feel here, being able to serve this union, doing the work of the union, but also that somehow Joe came back.
There's still the notion of organization, but what many of the members of the union do today, as much as one can gather, is more of an educational. The ideas of the union are still important. The notion that one should be able to control their own livelihood, where they work, their working conditions, that's important to the union. What is produced, that's important. That's what the union works for. The IWW keeps alive the idea that you don't organize simply because you want more money. In fact, the IWW would probably find it repugnant to think of the idea that if I can increase my wages with respect to everybody else, this is good, which means that I can make myself better off by increasing the poverty levels of other people or miserating other people. The IWW is not interested in that. Of course it wants to organize, it wants to increase the wages of its workers, but its ultimate purpose is to get rid of the wage system, get rid of the existing status quo.
The Wobblies have never been just about the workplace. Yeah, economically and logically and politically, that's where our power is. It's in the workplace. And if we don't deal with that, we're not going to deal with anything. That's true. If we don't deal with the rest of it, if we don't sing and have fun, if we don't deal with issues of race and sex, then that's never going to be enough.
Well, like old Joe Ator, the great Wobbly organizer of the Lawrence Textile Strike, said to those thousands of workers at the gates of the factory, the workers, with their hands in their pockets, have more power than the combined power of the bosses, besides which the bosses can't put their hands there. You just put your hands in your pockets and everything stops. You know, you figure out where the real power is. There is power in the union. Let's sing that one. This is Joe's best song. Oh, would you have freedom from wage slavery? Then come join the grand industrial band. Or would you from misery and hunger be free? Come on, do your share, lend a hand. And there is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. And that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Oh, would you have mansions of gold in the sky and live in a shack that's away in the back? Or would you have wings up in heaven to fly and starve here with rags on your back? But there is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. And that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Now if you like sluggers a beat in your head, oh, don't organize, all union despise. If you want nothing before you are dead, shake hands with your boss and look wise. But there is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. And that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. So come all ye workers from every land and come join the grand industrial band. Then we our share of this earth shall demand. Come on, do your share, lend a hand. And there is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. And that's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand. Power in the union.
Now, Joe Hill's ashes. Of course, this is what everybody's really interested in these days since some were discovered. Joe Hill himself, after he was shot, was transported to Chicago. The union had a memorial service for him. He He was cremated the next day, and his ashes were taken to the Union office. The Union then divided up the ashes into little packets. They were supposedly given to any branch around the United States and overseas, and they were to be dispersed whenever the people desired, but hopefully perhaps on May 1st. In 1917, when the office was raided by the government not only picked up paper clips, pens, pencils, love letters, trash, they also picked up ashes. Now, at this time, a packet was taken out of the office, apparently. And this is all conjecture because we have no real hard evidence. Put in an envelope and mailed to a person on the south side of Chicago. The official statement by the post office is that when this packet was put through the machine, it got ripped, and they saw who it was, and they confiscated it under the Espionage Acts, I believe, that were passed at this time, where you could confiscate mail. They later transferred to National Archives in the mid-40s, and that's where the packet has been ever since. And a person who was connected with UAW Solidarity's magazine heard about it. The story proved to be true. UAW Solidarity ran it as a piece in the May 1988 issue of UAW Solidarity. So I called up National Archives, got a hold of a person who was mentioned in the article who dealt with the ashes, and told them, I represent the industrial workers of the world, and we would like to have our ashes back. This picture right here is the transference of the ashes from the National Archives to the IWW. And here's Utah Phillips and myself standing outside the National Archives with Joe Hill's ashes. What will probably happen to him, at least in part, is that there is a memorial for a massacre of Columbine in Colorado, where a number of IWW strikers were shot down by the Colorado State Police in 1927. And the unveiling of this memorial will be the same time that they would at least set part of the ashes to the wind.
The strike in 1927 was an IWW strike. It was the first time in the history of Colorado that all the mines in the state were shut down, with the exception of a few. One of those mines that was still in operation was the Columbine, and they used to have very large picket lines there every morning, and they were, for the most part, good-natured picket lines. The workers went there and sang songs. A lot of people came out from the towns just to watch the picket because it was like a party. And Josephine Roach, the major stockholder at the mine, served them coffee and donuts. She was, in fact, in favor of signing union contracts. But her attitude towards the strikers upset some of the more powerful coal mine operators, Rockefeller, for example. And those coal mine operators, unbeknownst to her, had state rangers sent out by the governor, and there's good evidence that they in fact planned to do violence on Monday morning, November 21st, 1927, and set up machine guns and ordered out bayonets and helmets the nights before. But when the miners approached the mine that morning on November 21st, 1927, the gates were locked, and the guards told them they couldn't come in. The state rangers began to throw rocks and tear gas. The miners returned the tear gas and the rocks. They began to break through the fence, and the firing began. 6 miners were killed outright. Between 30 and 60 were wounded. The state rangers swore that the miners were armed and fired first, but there's no evidence of that and no wounds to support that. But the miners are buried here. This is the stone that we had set just a couple of weeks ago. The miner on the front of the stone comes from a picture of one of the miners who lives here in town. It's a picture of his father. I'll show you the back side of this monument in a second. It's an exact replica of the Columbine tipple that was taken from a picture of the tipple.
These 5 men are going to receive a very special honor this morning. Joe Hill, internationally famous poet, songwriter, and organizer, was murdered in the state of Utah, November 19th, 1915. He asked to be cremated and have his ashes spread wherever working men assembled, everywhere except Utah. He didn't want to be found dead in the state of Utah. Joe would be very happy, very honored to know that he's with these men. Carlos Cortez, a wobbly poet, artist, and writer who's come all the way down from Chicago to be with us today. We're chosen him to scatter these ashes as he's the oldest wobbly present. I'm not admitting my age. Carlos.
Joe, this part of you has been held prisoner at the government offices too long. Yeah. It's high time that you get back among your own people again.
My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body, oh, if I could choose, I would to ashes it reduce, and let the merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you, Joe Hill.